Now, this is a game that involves international politics and the biggest players, China and the United States. It involves questions of law and politics. It involves questions of what is international law? What's its nature? What's its role? What are the institutions of international law that have to be utilized and respected? It's got everything but sex, and who knows what will emerge as this complex dispute evolves. In any event, we're awfully lucky to have both Ambassador Hill and Director Zhu from China. And I see, according to the program, the order of speakers suggests that Chris Hill will be the first speaker and Dean Zhu Zhenghu will be the second. They may want to have some exchange. I'll certainly try to provoke them. And then we'll obviously want to bring in the audience and do as much as we can. Probably Ambassador Hill will want to skip out by 10:30. He's got to make an 11 o'clock train for Washington, which is why we've had to reverse the panel. But let's see how it goes. Chris, would you lead off, please?
Well, thank you very much, Jerry. And let me say at the outset what a pleasure it is to be here at the Asia Society. I believe this institution, perhaps more than any other institution, has been responsible for shrinking the size of the Pacific Ocean and bringing the United States and East Asia closer together. I appreciate the fact that the Asia Society has many programs in the arts, culture, and as well as in politics and economics. And I think there is no place that has a broader and stronger platform for dealing with these issues between the United States and East Asia. Needless to say, sitting next to someone like Jerry Cohen, I'm not in a position to talk about the legal ramifications of the issues in the South China Sea. Oh, okay.
Sorry, Chris.
I
think we should all turn off our cell phones.
Okay. Well, that derailed my train of thought. No, let me maybe set out what the U.S. policy has been, and I will look forward to hearing from my fellow dean. General Zhu, I don't know if you have the same experience I do of being a dean, but it's not like being an ambassador or being like a general. I mean, you basically say things in faculty meeting and people kind of stare at you and then do whatever they want. So it's a kind of different world. I mean, frankly, I have more attention from this audience than I do from faculty meetings at times. So I'll make a few comments from the U.S. perspective, and I'd be very interested to hear what Dean Zhu Zhenghu believes from the Chinese perspective. First of all, I'm of the view that maritime issues are hardly unprecedented, and while the South China Sea, I think, presents many more challenges than many other maritime issues, there are methods, there are institutions, there are procedures for dealing with these. And I think it's quite eminently solvable. And I think, assuming goodwill on everyone's part, it should be a situation where you do not have, where conflict should not emerge unless it emerges from some kind of miscalculation. I think from the U.S. perspective, we have, the United States does not take a position with respect to the sovereignty issues of the South China Sea. This is not because we've looked at the South China Sea and decided, boy, we don't want to get involved with the sovereignty issues there. This is basically a long-standing and broad-based policy of trying not to be involved with sovereignty issues or issues that do not involve U.S. sovereignty but involve others' sovereignty. So those countries, those partners, those allies of the United States who see that the United States kind of demurs on the issue of sovereignty questions need not take it personally, because it's something that the U.S. does essentially all around the world. I think the U.S. Also takes a position that there needs to be freedom of navigation. I think Secretary Clinton asserted this with respect to the South China Sea. This is also a long-standing position of the U.S. that you see all over the world. And finally, the U.S. wants to see a peaceful resolution of the disputes, and that is also, I think, very self-evident. Now, whether there can be a peaceful resolution of the issue, my sense is that the issue is not ripe yet for legal and therefore final resolution of the issues, as much as we would like it to be. I don't think there is a kind of emerged consensus for kind of resolving the issue once and for all, whether through arbitration or some other procedure. And I think the reason has to do with how the issue has evolved and what the attitudes are to the issue from the participants. I think there is no more complex country in the world than China. It is always painful to hear people in this country especially, but many other countries, say China believes this, China believes that. I think the fact that China has over 1 billion citizens, with many of whom where there are some 2 billion points of view on many of these issues, you should not look for some kind of easy fix or easy approach to dealing with Chinese attitudes to this issue or any issue. I know, for example, having dealt many times with the Chinese over North Korea, that there too, China has, there are many complexities to Chinese thinking and Chinese attitudes toward the situation in North Korea, and I suspect that with respect to Chinese thinking about the South China Sea, there are also many different points of view there. One issue that I think China is facing, it's an issue that many countries around the world are facing, I mentioned this last night, and that is kind of emerging nationalism. I think it's not enough to understand China today just in terms of what the government thinks, any more than it is to understand the U.S. and what the U.S. government thinks. I think there are many different attitudes within China. I think the role of technology in bringing some of those opinions to the fore. Internet users. I mean, anytime you have 500 million internet users, you can expect some feisty opinions on a lot of different issues. So I think China does confront, as many countries confront, a problem of nationalism, a problem of a certain percentage of its citizens thinking the government has been too weak on issues that they deem to be of national importance, or to use that Chinese phrase, of core importance. So the issue is not whether China has nationalism the way everyone else has nationalism. The issue is, what is China doing about the nationalism? And I feel that the Chinese government, I will use an academic approach, needs to improve in this area. I think the Chinese government needs to deal with these expressed concerns, not by repressing them, but by dealing with them, and not by acceding to them either, but rather by having, I think, a more honest debate within China of what their core interests are in the South China Sea, and can those core interests, if there are core interests, can those interests be harmonized with the interests of their neighbors. China, it is not in China's interest, it's frankly not for me to presume what China's interests are, but my opinion is it is not in China's interest to get into a maritime dispute with 4 of its neighbors, 4 neighbors who are rather closely and increasingly linked to 6 other neighbors. So it's not in China's interest to have this kind of increasingly deep-seated problem with ASEAN. And so I think any kind of Chinese look at the South China Sea needs to take into account that when you have four maritime neighbors in a major disagreement with you, you ought to look at it and determine whether you want your relationship with these four maritime neighbors to be entirely characterized by a maritime dispute. I'm not suggesting that all maritime disputes are somehow 19th century disputes, but I do feel that there are 21st century approaches to dealing with these, and that they should not just be looked at from the point of view of sovereignty, but they should be looked at from the point of view of kind of a win-win approach. There too, I think the Chinese need to think hard about what could be a win-win with these countries. What has clearly so far not been a win-win is for China to say we will only deal with these countries individually. These are a series of bilateral disputes. This approach, whatever the Chinese believe to be the logic of it, this approach of reducing this to a set of bilateral issues is not acceptable to the other countries involved, and they regard it as a bit of a cynical approach because it suggests that China feels it can kind of play these countries off against each other and deal with the problem in a way that maximizes Chinese leverage and minimizes the leverage of these other countries. So that kind of approach, while I understand the logic of it from the Chinese side, it doesn't work with its interlocutors in this, and China might consider simply rolling that one back into the garage and thinking about some other way to deal with this. Again, I am not optimistic that legal or arbitration or other processes at this point can get to a solution. But I do believe that we are in the 21st century, and we should be able to do a better job of building structures in the meantime for when people are prepared to have a serious negotiation. And I don't see signs of that at this point. So I think there need to be some efforts of freedom of navigation. There needs to be some effort to head off kind of problems that might happen, whether in the air or in the sea there, and I think those can be done without prejudicing the eventual settlement in a legal means. I think for China, this is really a very, even though there are those, and I would be one of them, who suggest that South China Sea is not a core interest to China, I believe a peaceful resolution, a peaceful way forward with these countries, with China's neighbors, is a core interest for China. Because I think as China is emerging, as China is, I think, a country with global reach, global scope, really a civilizational country, I mean a country that has such fundamental importance to our entire world, how China manages relations with neighbors is a fundamental issue for China and the rest of the world. And China has, I mean, a legacy of 4,000 years to consider in dealing with its neighbors. But I think what China especially needs to do is try to work with those neighbors in a way that those neighbors feel comfortable with the fact that they themselves are confronted with a neighbor that is so much larger than they. And I think China needs to be respectful of the fact that being small countries, it's not easy to look at large countries. I don't mean to draw analogies between the United States and Latin America, but certainly the United States has learned some lessons for dealing with very small countries in Latin America, and to try to come up with means by which those countries feel that we are showing the utmost respect to their interests, etc. And I think China might want to consider how it's going to manage these relationships. So I don't think the South China Sea is necessarily a core interest for China, but I think dealing with its Southeast Asian nations is a core interest for China, and I think there ought to be some more effort by the Chinese to deal with that core interest than on these kinds of 19th century questions of fishery rights and other things like that. So with those kind of initial comments, maybe we can hear from Dean Zhu.
Yeah, Dean Zhu.
Thank you, Professor, and thank you, Ambassador. I'm extremely honored to be invited to speak here in Nature Society, which is a very, very important think tank for promoting the relations between between the United States on the one hand and those countries in Asia on the other. To talk on the relationship between China and the United States in Southeast Asia, in South China Sea, I think I would start with the overall relationship between these two countries, because a Sino-U.S. relationship in South China Sea is only part of the overall relationship of the between the two countries. As far as the overall relationship between China and the United States, I believe it is generally good, because Sino-U.S. relations vary in different fields. If you look at the economic ties, I think it is very, very constructive, even though we have problems, but these problems will not produce any negative or tremendous negative impact on the overall relationship. And if you look at the exchanges between the peoples and the cultural exchanges, etc., they are pretty good. I think the problem in the relations between China and the United States lie in the security field or military field. If you look at that field of the relationship between China and the United States, you will find three major issues or problems. One is distrust. I believe this is the fundamental cause for this instability of the relationship between these two countries. Because of distrust, I think we have got another problem, that is miscalculation. Actually, on both sides, we have miscalculation. Chinese have miscalculations over the United States or the Americans, and the Americans have miscalculations over China. And the third, because of the first and the second problems, we have got the third problem, that is action and reaction, which is very important. Whether you accept or not, whether you agree or not, I think races between China and the United States are there and in different fields, from space to cyberspace to conventional and even and non-traditional security fields. So, and the present situation, if you look at the first problem, you may find that whatever Chinese say, that China will develop in a peaceful way. I don't think this will be trusted by the United States or by some of the scholars and the practitioners in the United States, because the Americans may prefer to mirror image China. They would prefer to look at China's development and future development from their own experience, or from the experience of in the history, in which most of the rising powers have risen through wars or through military means, through expansion. But China is different, I believe. If you look at the history of China, look at the military tradition and the culture of China, I think Chinese have always been reactive and defensive in their policies. In this regard, I hope the scholars on China in watching China will study into the history and tradition and the traditional culture of the Chinese side. Of course, it is very difficult for the Chinese to trust the United States, because if the Chinese look at the behavior of the United States, that they cannot believe these actions of the American side are good for the interests of China. For example, arms sale to Taiwan, close reconnaissance, which has been a very, very high intensity and frequency. And some people even argue the frequency and the intensity of the close range reconnaissance against China is much, much greater than that the United States committed against the former Soviet Union in the Cold War years. And if you look at the military exercises around China, most of them have been pointed against China. Even though the Americans argue that they are short of money, but they spend so much on the military exercises. Why can't the Chinese would argue, why cannot you cancel a little bit of these exercises? So the Chinese will never understand that all these sort of things are good for the interests of the of Chinese. So under such a circumstances, how can Chinese trust the United States? So it's very, very difficult. This is because this is the distrust between these two countries. And if we look at stemming from the distrust, I think we have miscalculations. Everything is done by China is intent to against China. And the Chinese believe that all the behaviors in East Asia or Western Pacific have been intended to, against China, against China's development, and aimed at encircling and containing China's peaceful rise or peaceful development. So I don't think this sort of argument is right. Therefore, these miscalculations led to the third issue, as I mentioned just now, actions and reactions. I think there is no need for me to specify all these sort of actions, but they are there. Even though many people don't believe that there are rises, especially in China. But I think that's true. So these are the three major issues. So and such as against this backdrop, Chinese leaders have advocated to establish a new type of relationship between major powers. I believe that this sort of idea is mainly referred to the relationship between China and the United States, because these two countries are too important. The relationship between these two countries are too important. If China and the United States can cooperate with each other, I believe that the world will be peace. The world will be peaceful. If China and the United States can cooperate with each other in East Asia and the Western Pacific, I think the Pacific Ocean will be Pacific. Otherwise, it will not be Pacific enough, if we look at the situation there. So, I believe that by new relationship between China and the United States, I think the new is mainly manifested in the following field. One is the new situation. If you look at the situation there between China, in the world today, I think the first one is that we are in the globalization age, in which China and the United States are becoming increasingly interdependent. Chinese are heavily dependent on the United States, and the United States, of course, is dependent to some extent on China. I don't think without the cooperation, without the support, without technological transfer, without market of the United States, without capital of the United States, without the cooperation between those two countries, I don't think Chinese could have been able to develop so fast and up to the present standard. Of course, in the future, I believe that this sort of interdependence will continue to increase. So under such a situation, I believe that cooperation is the only way out between these two countries. Secondly, I believe that there are a lot of common interests between these two countries. I think there is no way for us to deny this sort of common interest. We have common interest on the bilateral basis. We have common interest in the regional context. We have common interest in the global context. I believe that this cooperation, this common interest need China and the United States to cooperate with each other in the future. Otherwise, the common interest between these two countries cannot be achieved, and the interests of regional and global context cannot be achieved either. Third new content is that under the present situation, the world needs China and the United States. I mean, China and the United States are obligated to perform wider missions and obligations or responsibilities for the stability, for the peace, and for development of different regions and the world at large. These are very, very important, I believe. I hope that the policymakers, practitioners, as well as the scholars in both countries can understand that. Lastly, I believe that science and development in science and technology, especially the development of sophisticated weapons, can make us to understand that on the peace and the war, there are only two outcomes, either win-win or lose-lose. There will never be a zero-sum outcome between China and the United States in the future. So this is very important. So this is the new situation. And I believe that the new situation will force the two sides to have new ideas. This is second new element. New ideas and the new thinking. This is very important. I think both Chinese and Americans should jump out from the Cold War mentality. This is very important. Don't try to seek zero-sum outcome. There will never be zero-sum outcome in the future between these two countries. This is what I believe. Of course, we need, because we need new ideas, we need new thinking, and thirdly, we need new behavior. I think in this regard, both Chinese and Americans should respect the core interest of the other side and should take into consideration the security concerns of the other side. These are very important because they can only achieve their own interests by cooperation. If you neglect the core interest of the other side, I don't think the other side will respect your own core interest or security concerns. These are very important. And fourthly, I believe that under the present situation, we need new mechanisms for crisis management. Even though we have got more than 90 mechanisms of consultation and dialogue between China and the United States, but I don't think that's enough, especially in the security field. We need new mechanisms in managing the crisis which likely appear in the future. For example, in the maritime security, in the space security, in the cyber security, etc. So in all these fields, we need to have or establish new mechanisms of crisis management.
Well, we've heard two very good introductory statements, general principles that we should keep in mind as we address the South China Sea problems. But as a famous American jurist once said, general principles don't decide concrete cases. And the issues that we're beginning to touch on as I listen to the speakers at least embrace the following topics. One question is, what is freedom of navigation? We're all for it, but what is it? What does each side mean? Are there different definitions, different perceptions here? Another is peaceful resolution. Everybody's for peaceful resolution of disputes, but does that mean only negotiations? If negotiations fail, is there a role for international law? Are there commitments under UNCLOS to using third-party arbitration or determination by adjudication in appropriate circumstances? And what is the U.S. attitude toward that? We've seen from the Chinese response to the Philippine negotiation what the Chinese government is. We know there are many attitudes within every government, but what is the official position taken by a government is really determinative, and we have to look at. I don't know yet what the U.S. position is with respect to resort to third-party determination, as in the Philippine claim. Are we for it? Are we neutral? Are we against it? It sounds like our diplomats are pretty conservative people. But is there a changing situation in the world where international law is becoming more important, especially as a defense of the weak against the strong? So we have to ask, are we up to date in our attitudes toward international law? Nationalism, I like what Ambassador Hill has said about nationalism in every country, including this country. And of course, the Chinese government, as he implies, can do a lot to shape the attitude of the Chinese people, more than most governments can. Another question is, what is bilateral? I think it's too simple to say China wants bilateral negotiations, that ASEAN wants multilateral. Vietnam has used bilateral negotiations successfully with China in the Gulf of Tonkin in adjusting the land boundary. But when Vietnam tries to approach China to discuss the paracels, bilateral negotiations don't seem to interest China because there is no dispute, just as we've heard the same kind of argument about the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands or Takashima Dokdo with respect to Japan and Korea. So it's not accurate to say China always wants bilateral negotiations. Sometimes they don't want negotiations on certain key issues and only on others. Finally, a question I'd like to hear a discussion on is what about respect for international law and commitments under treaties and having disputed claims impartially decided? I think we're witnessing a shift here in international politics, and I think there's not only a rising China to contend with, I think there's a rising international law if the weaker countries really seek to use it. And I think China in the mid-19th century adopted Western international law as a defensive weapon against the colonial imperialist powers. And I think international law, like domestic law, is a tool for the weaker party. In China, domestically, we see that law is increasingly being seized upon by the weaker classes in society that don't have access to the high party figures, that aren't really rich people. It's the last and only defense of the ordinary people against arbitrary local government and sometimes arbitrary central government. And I think there's an analogy here. Well, let's hear. I'd like to provoke our two speakers for a moment, and then I hope the audience will take part.
Okay, well, you've already provoked us, I guess. Well, I'll start with the old Groucho Marx line. Here are my principles, and if you don't like them, I've got some others. I mean, your point's well taken, but, you know, China is not some thing that emerged out of Westphalia in 1648. China is a rather unique country out there in the landscape. It's, as I said, a civilizational country. I didn't mean that just from the point of view of culture. It's a country whose relations with its neighbors is characterized by a very different past than what we might see in other regions of the world. I don't think China is, I mean, and I will defer to Dean Zhu about this, but I just don't see the South China Sea as a place where China will accept a notion of international arbitration or even you know, turn this over to international law. I think it's something that at this stage there needs to be I think a stronger political commitment within China to working out relations with these countries. Quite apart from the issue of the seascape, I think they have to work out the relations with these maritime countries. To me, it is a question of how China deals with its with the periphery, with its near abroad, to use that annoying expression from old Soviet days, and how China is going to deal with countries that clearly feel that the issue is a core interest to them. So I think a complicating factor has been that despite some scope for dealing with the public attitudes to the South China Sea, the Chinese government has not tried to deal with this, perhaps because the Chinese government has a lot on its plate. I don't think it's because the Chinese government wants to fan the flames of nationalism. I think it has to do with the fact that it has other priorities. I do want to, however, suggest that this is, as much as we can talk about the U.S. and China relationship, I think this issue of the South China Sea is not so much a bilateral relationship with the U.S. I think it's a question from the U.S. perspective of seeing how China is going to manage these relationships. And I think it's important to us, it's important in our attitudes to China to see how China manages these relationships. It's important that these issues be resolved through peaceful means. I don't, by the way, have a statutory definition of freedom of navigation. I sort of know it when I see it, to use the old line. But certainly, I mean, I think if you're a Vietnamese fisherman right now, you don't kind of feel it. And so those issues need to be resolved. But I think this is a fundamental issue for what kind of China is emerging on this world stage. I'd like to make one other point, which is I completely agree with General Zhou that we have a kind of problem of strategic mistrust. In fact, I think we have a mountain of mistrust. I don't think it's been particularly helped by some of the sort of talkaholics out of Washington think tanks, this notion that somehow we are in inevitable conflict with China. But I don't think one can extrapolate from comments made in think tanks to say that the U.S. somehow regards conflict inevitably, nor, in my view, does it suggest that the effort by the U.S. to show renewed interest in East Asia, the so-called pivot, is somehow some interest in doing to China what the Soviet Union tried to do to China, which was to create some kind of encircling mechanism against China. The notion of renewed interest of the U.S. to Asia is not about trying to contain or restrain China. It has to do with trying to focus on the important and not just the urgent all the time. And for those of us who've spent time in the Middle East, we understand how those urgent problems have a way of not going away. But certainly, I think we need to focus more on some of our longer-term interests, and I would say those are in East Asia. But I don't think that needs to be reacted to in China as an expression that somehow the U.S. is seeking to contain China. So I'll stop there and look forward to General Zhu's comments.
Thank you very much.
General Zhu.
Thank you very much. Actually, I did touch upon Sino-U.S. relations over South China Sea. I believe that China and the United States share a lot of common grounds in South China Sea. First of all, both China and the United States hope to maintain peace and stability in the region. Secondly, both China and the United States hope that the freedom of navigation can be maintained, or we can maintain peace and the security of sea lanes of communication. Thirdly, I believe that both sides advocate that the status quo is not violated by any side. And fourthly, I believe that both China and the United States hope to avoid military confrontation in South China Sea. Lastly, both China and the United States hope to have the peaceful resolution to the disputes over South China Sea. I think these are the common grounds. Of course, we have differences. For example, on the freedom of navigation. Actually, the freedom of navigation of U.S. vessel in this area has never been subject or jeopardized by any state actors, not to mention China. It is because China is more dependent on the sea lanes of communication and the freedom of navigation, because South China Sea is actually the lifeline of China's economic development. I think no country in the world today needs much greater than that Chinese need on the freedom of navigation and the security or safety of the sea lanes of slugs in South China Sea. Therefore, we have no reason to undermine the freedom. If you look at history in the past few years, I don't think Chinese have taken any action to undermine the freedom of navigation of the United States. Of course, China and the United States have differences over freedom of navigation. We Chinese don't believe that the reconnaissances and collecting of security informations or military informations of freedom of belongs to the freedom of navigation. So we Chinese and Americans have different understandings. And I believe that the issues we have heard about in the past few years, what I want to emphasize is that, one, in South China Sea, we hope to maintain the status quo. That's the consistent policy of China. Secondly, China's behaviors in South China Sea have always been reactive. We have never taken any initiative. And thirdly, present tension or crisis have got something to do with pivot, rebalance, or back to Asia strategies of the United States. Actually, maybe the American friends look at these issues from different angle. But if we look at these issues, look at the strategies of the United States, I think from the Chinese perspective, I think they have got three outcomes or consequences. One is the fact that these strategies have brought about huge and tremendous concerns among the Chinese elites, because many people believe that these strategies are partly, at least, intended to contain China's development. Because some of the explanations from the American side cannot justify the actions and behavior. Secondly, with the introduction of the strategies I mentioned just now, some new flashpoints have been created, like Huaiyang Island or Diaoyu Islands. And thirdly, I think with the introduction of this strategy in the future, I believe many countries in East Asia will have to be forced to take side. I think that will be a very, very dangerous issue between China in East Asia. Of course, if you look at the behavior, if you look at the recent crisis over Diaoyu Island and the Huaiyang Island, I hope you will recall the history. What Chinese have done. It is not the Chinese that first broke the status quo in either Diaoyu Island and South China Sea. So I believe that Chinese actions have always been reactive. We have never taken any initiative actions against any side. These are the points I want to mention. About nationalism, that's true. To be very frank, I'm strongly against nationalism at home. But I think nationalism is not the only phenomenon in China. I think it can be seen and witnessed throughout the world, especially for those countries who have problems at home. Because nationalism always rises with the emergency of problems at home. And sometimes they may try to shift the concerns of the people at home. Of course, in China, I don't think the Chinese government intendedly to encourage the nationalism in China. I believe nationalism is a double-edged sword. It might be good for the leadership and for the government. But to some extent, it might be very, very, very bad for the government and for the leadership, especially like the situation in China. So this is something I want to emphasize about the ASEAN approach to the resolution of the South China Sea. As a Chinese, I'm not against multilateral resolution to dispute. Even ASEAN can approach this issue in a unified way. But if we look at history, I'm really wondering, multiple forum or platform is the best way to seek resolution to the issue. I once talked to Singaporeans. Singaporeans are very good. They are the brain of Southeast Asian nations. And they encourage to seek the resolution of South China Sea dispute by negotiating between China on the one hand and ASEAN members on the other. I would suggest the Singaporeans and my friends like Professor Huang, etc., to settle the disputes themselves among the members of ASEAN first. If you are capable enough, you can settle it first and then come back to China. You can negotiate with China together. So that's not the best way to solve the disputes. As far as the international arbitrary, how do I pronounce it? Yeah. I don't think it has arrived the time to solve this issue. And this has got something to do with nationalism at home. If this is not properly handled, nationalism may produce very huge damage to the stability of the society at home, and even to the whole process of development at home. I don't think any leader or any organization in China have the bravery, have the dare to put forward, put these sort of issues to international court. That will arouse the opposition from people throughout the country. So I hope that outsiders will understand the situation in China. As for the so that's what I want to respond. Yeah.
Well, that was another eloquent statement. I want to open it up in a second. I just want to make a couple of other remarks. One is, I don't think we should assume that China's attitude toward dispute resolution is fixed eternally. It has evolved very considerably in the last 30 years, 40 years really. In 1971, I had a chance to meet for several hours with Zhou Enlai and his staff, and it was after China, PRC represented China in the UN. I said, now that the PRC was in the UN, it should change its attitude toward international law and nominate somebody for the International Court of Justice. Well, the laughter that suggestion evoked, people thought I was a comedian. How could you make such a ridiculous suggestion that China would want to put somebody on the ICJ? It took 10 years before China decided to do that. And since then, they've had extremely able, distinguished participation in the ICJ. China now takes part in third-party decision-making arbitration in the WTO to a great extent. China, in its commercial relations, has established many arbitration institutions and is the world's busiest site for using arbitration to settle international commercial disputes. In 1972, when I first went to China, if you suggested arbitration of commercial disputes, they would say in China, that would be a very unfriendly act. But as was said last night, arbitration has to be perceived in international relations as not necessarily an unfriendly act, but a friendly way of settling disputes when other means, peaceful means, seem to fail. the attitude is changing. And I think this could be a watershed for China. Undoubtedly, there are people in China who, when consulted about how China should answer the Philippine claim before ITLOS for arbitration, who favored doing it, at least to the point of arguing that ITLOS has no jurisdiction in this case under the Chinese exceptions that were made. But China did commit itself to arbitration and adjudication in certain circumstances when it ratified UNCLOS. So I think we're witnessing a change. China is evolving more and more. It wants the respect of the world community. And I think we should encourage this trend toward acceptance of adjudication to settle parts of very complex disputes. As I said last night, this has to be broken down into many different pieces, and it has to go step by step. And often, resort to a litigation or arbitration doesn't result in an ultimate decision. It results in stimulating negotiations that previously had been ineffective. And we shouldn't underestimate that possibility. Well, we have at least a half hour here. I'd like to hear from people, and we're off. Yes, would you please identify yourself and try to be brief?
Hi, hello. Walter Lohman with the Heritage Foundation. General Zhu, it's good to see you. I'm going to raise an issue that we talked about at some length at Heritage maybe last year when you came by over lunch. Given that the two big issues at stake or involved in this from the U.S. perspective is the 9-dash map and certain comments that Dai Bingguo made to Secretary Clinton that South China Sea is a core interest. Now, there are people who doubt that. They're essentially doubting the word of the Secretary of State in that regard. But given that those are the two big things from the U.S. perspective, why doesn't China clarify publicly what it means by both of those things? And if it's not a core interest, why not say so publicly frequently? Ambassador Hill will be familiar with having to repeat American positions over and over again at various levels in all kinds of different situations. Why shouldn't China do that? Why can't it do it? And why shouldn't we expect it to do that? That's what any country in the world would do if its statements were being misportrayed or if its statements were at the heart of some sort of volatile conflict like this. Thank you.
First of all, among the Chinese, there are different views, and some people even asked Mr. Dai Bingguo if he stated that the South China Sea is the core interest of China. And of course, I did not have a chance to get access to him, to ask him directly the question. To be very frank on the South China Sea issue, there are controversial views over the issue whether South China Sea is the core interest of China. Because many people believe that it is the core interest of China because it is closely related with sovereignty and territorial integrity. But some people believe that South China Sea issue is different from Taiwan issue, from Tibet issue. So there are controversial views. So at present time, I don't think that we Chinese have got a very, very strict definition over the issue. But I believe that because of the rising crisis over South China Sea, more and more Chinese people would prefer to define South China Sea as the core interest.
What does that mean to say a core interest? Does a core interest mean your maximum position can never tolerate any compromise? Yeah. What does it mean? I don't know. I know it means it's very important to you, but so what? Yeah. Where does that push us?
Yeah, I think different countries have got different definitions of core interest. In China, according to Mr. Dai Bingguo, 3 issues are core interest of China. One is territorial integrity and sovereignty. Second is the environment of peaceful development. And the third is actually the continuation of the political system in China. Because either any of them is undermined may bring disorder and choice and disturbance in China. Any of them has problems may have chained reaction over other core interest. So by core interest, I understand is that this interest cannot be damaged by the outsiders.
So it means if China claims all the islands in the South China Sea, the world simply has to accept it with no other opportunity for judgment. Is that what core interest means?
No, on South China Sea, I think the Chinese would prefer to maintain status quo. And the Chinese have never tried any efforts to undermine the status quo. If you look at the situation over the disputes in the islands, I think Chinese actions have always been reactive.
I think what is interesting about the South China Sea issue is when I was on the circuit as Assistant Secretary, I would talk to the Vietnamese, the Filipinos, Malaysians, etc., all of whom had this difference with China on the South China Sea. I mean, this is not new. There's nothing new here. But all of them said, we're trying to manage this. We don't want this to be a big issue. We value our relationship with China. We need to work through this. Basically, I didn't offer that the United States should be involved, but nor did they at all want us to be involved. And now you fast forward to today, and all of those countries have open, overt disagreements with China that have colored their relationships, their basic relationships with China. This is not in their interest, it's not in China's interest, certainly not in our interest. And so the question is, what are people trying to do about it? And I think the U.S. position has been, this needs to be worked out peacefully. We're not going to take a position on sovereignty. And so how have the Chinese dealt with this? And it has been to kind of ratchet up the importance, whether it's core interests or just important interests for China with the South China Sea. It's ratcheted up that. It's made comments out of Beijing, which have required people in Manila and elsewhere to make other comments. And essentially, maybe without knowing it, or maybe simply putting it into a domestic Chinese issue, it's increased tensions in a way that, again, I'm not going to speak for Chinese interests, but I don't see it in China's interest to have problems with all of these partners. And by the way, if China says, well, we didn't start the nationalism, they did, well, then you have to say Vietnam is doing something that it hadn't done before, Philippines is doing something. You have to go through all four of them to suggest that 4 different countries have ratcheted up nationalism such that China's had to do it itself. So I really think it's kind of in China's interest to try to tamp down these issues with these countries and to do it in a little better job than it's been doing lately.
Charles Evans Hughes was a great American Secretary of State and Chief Justice of the United States. In his autobiography, he wrote, "The gravest wounds are self-inflicted." And I think that applies here. Director General Ha. You have a microphone? Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. I would like to thank Professor Zhu for his...
Hear you.
Oh. It's on. I'd like to thank Professor Zhu for his comments, and I'm very interested when he said that China is interested in sustaining the status quo in the South China Sea. And I suspect that we might, from different countries in South China Sea, we might have different interpretation of the status quo. And I would like to take this opportunity to ask Professor Zhu whether he might be willing to identify what is his definition of the status quo. Because we have observed several incidents of changing the status quo on behalf of China, like in 1974, in 1988, and then in 1995, and then in 2009. continuous actions to change the status quo. So what would you define the status quo now?
I think status quo in history have got different meanings and different situations. If you look at the situation before 1960s, I don't think there was any dispute. All countries accepted that South China Sea is the territory of China. You look at the maps published. You mean the maps published by the Philippines in 1988? It is still included the Hualien Island in the territory of China. If you read the letter by Prime Minister Fan Wentong to Chinese minister, you will find that that's written in white paper and black ink. So that's you may have different understanding. So now the problem is that how to interpret how to manage the relationship between the original international laws and UNCLOS. This is a problem. UNCLOS have brought some difficulties to the issue. And of course, the discovery of oil and petroleum in South China Sea brought the differences in this region. I think at the present, maintenance of status quo means that the Chinese do not want to occupy all the islands that have been occupied by the other side. And the continuation of the exploration of oil, you can continue. But no party should increase the occupation over the islands. As we repeatedly cited following the occupation of the islands by different claimants. But after China's occupation of mischief, I think it has brought to the stability of the situation in this region for such a long time. And since that, I don't think Chinese have carried out any provocative actions. If you look at the present dispute over Hualien Island, I think if we call the international laws, 5 principles were applied to this sort of dispute. 1, who discovered first. 2nd, who gave the name to the island first. Chinese give the name to the island in 1287. What is the name of from the Philippines up to now? And third is the fact that who carry out exploration first. If you look at China's ancient Silk Road transit, if you look at the fishery activities of Chinese side, Chinese fishermen lived in this area in fishing for generations after generations. And lastly, I believe that who exercised the jurisdiction and management over these islands. So all this can be clearly shown which country these islands belong to. And lastly, I believe that is no party should eat the words they have made, or the pledges or the obligations they have committed. So these are the principles of international laws in the past. I know there are contradictions between these two, between the UNCLOS and the previous international laws. Of course, I'm not an expert on that. But we Chinese hope to maintain the status quo. If you look at the actions of the Philippines, without the kidnap of China's fishermen, without the retaining of China's fish boat, how could Chinese take those sort of actions of retaliation? That's what that's my answer to the question.
Yes, that gentleman here with the sweatshirt. Yeah.
Thank you. Hello? Yeah. Mel Maskin, Fordham. The issue of mistrust, and the connection to what each side perceives as the history to look for. On the one hand, we have Professor Zhu says China has not been offensively minded. That's, of course, contradicted by the conquest of the non-Han people all throughout its history. in the Qing Empire, in the dynasty, the expansion. And then we have Ambassador Hill saying the United States is not interested in non-U.S. sovereignty issues. Of course, when Iraq claimed Kuwait as the 19th province, the United States had a war. So just a little footnote there, we had a war against that, okay? So we were concerned. So now the question is, well, who to believe? It's a misrepresentation, though, of the history on both sides. Thank you.
Do you want to discuss the Iraq War now? No.
I don't think we can do that in 20 minutes.
Yeah.
Can't hear you.
No, but we're not going to take a position with respect to the sovereignty, to the issue of sovereignty with respect to this territorial dispute. With respect to an invasion of a neighboring country, yes, we do take a position on that.
Yes, please.
Thank you. My name is Jeannie Nguyen, with Voice of Vietnamese Americans. I'm Vietnamese and Americans. So I'm very interested in Dinh Chu about Chinese perception of the Southeast Asian Sea, which is the East Vietnamese Sea and the West Filipino Sea. And it's also part of Malaysians and part of Brunei. So China, since you claim the 9-dash line, like the question was raised, has increased tremendous anxiety in these neighbors. But to Vietnam, I believe Vietnam did not provoke China any time. In 1974, it was China who invaded Vietnam, Paracels Island. And so now if we come to joint venture, can Vietnam share the resource there with China? That would be brotherhood, a sisterhood, right? And I'm very interested in the fisheries and the fishing ban that China has implemented in the Southeast Asia Sea, especially in the East Sea of Vietnam. Many Vietnamese fishermen with no weapons were helpless, were killed, a ship was sank. So was that included in your status quo? Would that actions continue? And right. I also wanted to ask this one big question.
We don't have time for a long speech.
Okay.
We have many other people who would like to take part.
Yes, sir. So my question is to both Dinh Chu and Ambassador Hill. What do you think Vietnam can do to help both China and the U.S. to come to a compromise?
Thank you very much. I have never heard the name you mentioned, or East Vietnam Sea or what sea. But what I read from international publications, that's called South China Sea. By South China Sea, I do not mean that that belongs to South China. As far as the problem issue you mentioned as China's occupation of Xisha Island, I hope you will read the historical document written by the letter presented to China by your prime minister at that time. So I think that we Chinese have no problem, and we are making preparations to maintain the status quo, to maintain peace and stability. As far as the fishery, I think you are sending a lot of fishing boats to Xisha Islands. I'm really wondering if you are responsible for this issue or not, because I went to the Xisha Islands for quite a few times, and I saw the Vietnamese fish boats there. So I really wonder if you know the whole story of that. Thank you.
Professor Robert Beckman of National University of Singapore.
Yeah, trying to bring it back to U.S. and China interests in the South China Sea. As I see the problem developing over the last 10 years, it's the question of how the United States, as having been the preeminent naval power in the region, is going to have to get used to a different balance of power, and that China, as a rising naval power, they'll have to be sharing the naval power, as they will be perhaps with India and Japan. And one of the difficulties that's presented by China's position of what the U.S. calls a euphemism of freedom of navigation is that China is interpreting the economic zone concept in a way to limit U.S. military activities, including reconnaissance activities, which to me was start of the whole pivot or removal to Asia. But when you look at it from China's perspective now, what has happened in the last 3 years is U.S. has reestablished stronger defense relationships with South Korea, Japan, Philippines, Australia, Malaysia, Singapore, Myanmar. And should we be paranoid when Chinese get the view that maybe we're trying to surround it? Perhaps looking at it, they would see that this seems to be exactly what's happening. But my long-term question is for Professor Zhu. As a rising naval power, you are going to, like Spain and Portugal and England and every naval power, are going to want the same liberties that the United States Navy has wanted in 5 or 10 years from now. You're going to want to conduct the same activities off the coast of India or Japan that the United States now insists it has the right to do off your submarine base in Hainan. But as I see it, you are still acting like a middle-level country who's frightened by a big bad Navy, when 5 years from now you're going to be the big bad Navy threatening other people. So there's a time lag between the time your interests change and your policy changes. And when will that time lag be filled?
You know, it's true the U.S. has moved to strengthen security relations with countries in East Asia. Many of those relationships have been strengthened long before the word pivot ever entered the lexicon. I mean, I've always taken, I mean, frankly speaking, in early Bush administration, I think there was this idea that we could run our East Asia policy out of Japan and maybe Singapore and Australia, that those were the sort of 3 linking points. I think that's long changed. I think the U.S.-Korea relationship has greatly grown for a variety of reasons, and I would not put China in the top 10 of those reasons. I think it has to do with other things organic to the bilateral relationship and also to the North Korean threat, which my goodness, I mean, what has happened with the North Koreans in recent months under this Kim III, under Kim Jong-un, is just kind of appalling. And I think well, the one good thing that's happened is that the U.S. and China have tried to come together a little more over that issue. But I really hesitate, however, to characterize the Obama administration's efforts to step up our relations in Asia as being a security issue as opposed to a longer-term economic and political approach. And I would also note that while Secretary Rumsfeld tried to encourage, like, the Roh Moo-hyun government in South Korea to allow our bases to be used for so-called third party contingencies, the Koreans said no, and that's certainly been long since dropped. I mean, we're not interested in kind of arranging bases for the purpose of constraining China. And just one other comment, because I know there are other people who need to talk, but this issue of Myanmar, I mean, I had many conversations in Beijing, and the concern among the Chinese was this was a state that had, in addition to human rights problems, and had a lot of centrifugal forces, and you Americans need to get more serious about dealing with that country and understanding these centrifugal forces where the country was kind of breaking apart at the seams. And it was the Chinese who really encouraged, I think, a much more nuanced American position to Burma, to Myanmar, and I'm sorry it took into the next administration for the U.S. to figure it out.
Dean Drew, do you want to comment on Mr. Beckman's ideas?
Yes. I believe you have noticed that the Chinese PLA Navy has been developing very fast in the past few years. And I believe that we will continue to develop the PLA Navy. I think several reasons have led to the development of Chinese naval capabilities. One is the security environment of China, which is the most complicated one among all major powers. Secondly, China is becoming increasingly dependent on the slugs or sea lanes of communication. So we need to contribute more to the protection of security of sea lanes of communication in the world, not only on South China Sea, but also in other parts of the world. Thirdly, the international community is requiring or demanding China to make greater contribution to the maintainers of peace and stability in different regions. I mean, mainly the protection of slugs, like the escort operations in Bay of Aden or in the maritime area of Somalia. I think all these sort of things have prompted Chinese to develop naval capabilities. Of course, another issue is that, as you can see, that East Asia is an area which is frequently struck by natural disasters. So we need to provide humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. And this is usually done by Navy. And I still remember in 2004, when the tsunami occurred in Indonesia, I think Chinese collected a lot of relief goods, but unfortunately, because of the limited capabilities, these goods could not be sent to the disastrous tsunami-struck area. So these are the reasons. But I think we Chinese will not carry out the reconnaissances or close-range reconnaissances or those sort of investigations like the United States is doing in the exclusive economic zones of China, because that is something which may produce distrust between countries. And I believe Chinese will never do that unless we Chinese are done by others. Maybe we Chinese will take retaliatory actions against those countries that do this against China. Maybe in the future we will do it against the United States, not necessarily India or other countries. Thank you.
A gentleman in the third row. Yes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Stephen Loosely from the Australian Strategic Policy Institute in Canberra. A question for Ambassador Hill. Chris, in passing in your opening remarks, you alluded to what kind of architecture might need to be created over the longer term to settle disputes, such as we're seeing in the South China Sea at the moment. Now, of course, in the region, we already have an alphabet soup of organisations. I jotted down some. There's the AFT, the EAS, there's APEC, there's ASEAN Plus. Is one of those bodies suitable to be given an extra task of security negotiations, or do we need to look at yet another body as part of the architectural framework for settling disputes over the longer term? Professor Zhu might be interested in commenting on this too.
I don't think they should try to create a new mechanism. I think out of one of those there might be something. I mean, we used to work with the ASEAN Regional Forum, which did have a security dimension. We used to do sort of tabletop exercises, issues. I mean, what I tried to do during my watch was to shift the focus from sort of freedom of navigation issues, which get awfully complicated, especially when you consider the Indonesian archipelago and what the sovereignty issues are in those waterways. I tried to shift it to some sort of humanitarian operations. This was based on the fact that it seemed every other week we were having some kind of volcano or earthquake somewhere. We tried to set up my concept was really, I'd come out of Europe where the Partnership for Peace was, the PFP countries were doing a lot of these kinds of things. For example, we had U.S. Marines landing on the Polish coast being transported by Russian Navy and Russian landing craft, and the U.S. Marines set up a hospital on the Polish coast in as an exercise against some kind of natural disaster. So we tried this something like this in the Philippines. The Chinese, I'm sorry, were just very suspicious of what we were doing. And I think with a great deal of effort, including at very senior levels, we finally got the Chinese to send an observer. And then we ended up with something that was which went down to the next level below disaster relief, which was to go to search and rescue, where I think we sent a helicopter out over Manila Bay and dropped some hapless Filipino Marine and then picked him up with some search and rescue. It wasn't quite what we had in mind. And one of the frustrations was we couldn't get some of the countries who really should have been involved, like China, we couldn't get them more involved. So I still think that's the right approach. And I think that's the way to kind of overcome the mistrust between militaries. And I don't mean to be picking on the Chinese here, but it is discouraging that whenever we have disagreements on something like, Taiwan arms sales, although by the way, I was in Taiwan in December, and I've never seen so many Chinese tourists in my life, but that's another subject. So whenever we had these kind of disputes with China, the first thing the Chinese would do would cut off the military-to-military discussions. I think that should be the last thing that's cut off. Anyway, I would go with ASEAN Regional Forum and see if they can get anywhere.
John McAuliffe.
John McAuliffe. John McAuliffe of the Fund for Reconciliation and Development. I say one thing that the two countries, U.S. and China, have in common is euphemisms. Everything we always do is for defensive purposes. Everything is to protect the status quo and avoid somebody else creating problems. But one would wonder what the U.S. reaction would be if China conducted military exercises with Venezuela, Cuba, Ecuador, Nicaragua in the Caribbean. One also wonders, when the U.S. gives moral advice to China about respecting its neighbors, why it doesn't do the same thing in Latin America in terms of Cuba, since everybody thinks we're all out of our minds in terms of our Cuba policy. Question to ask: obviously, everybody in a territorial dispute has historical reasons, nomenclature reasons, even the obvious sensitivity about South China Sea versus East Sea versus whatever. I mean, there seems not to be a rational solution to these things, and hopefully none of them get resolved in military ways. But going back to Ambassador Hill's earlier comments, one wonders if there is some other form recognizing that, in fact, the nation state has a declining role in real problems in the world, whether some form of internationalization of territories where there is legitimate claim, historical, ethnic, cultural, on both sides, that some kind of internationalization is the solution.
Quick answer, Chris. You've got to go.
I think when the time is ripe, I think some kind of internationalization is the solution. But by the way, I don't think all those Caribbean countries would want to do exercises with China, because I think we've got our problems, and I'm not here to defend the Cuban embargo, believe me. But we have worked on those relationships over the years. The United States has. I think many of our relationships are much better in the Caribbean than in the past, and I think we've really tried to make some adjustments to how we've dealt with our neighbors. And I think people who've been involved with some of those issues should be very proud of how we've managed the problems, notwithstanding the continued issues in Cuba. So.
We've still got 5 minutes to go, but Ambassador Hill has got to leave. So
yeah, I'll be back, but I have to do this trip.
Yeah.
And I'll be back later.
Oh, you're coming back
from New York, and I'll be here tomorrow morning for the wrap-up.
Good.
Yeah.
So we'll find out what the solution is from you tomorrow. Yes, sir. See you.
James Taylor.
Can't hear you.
James Taylor. Professor Zhu, I wanted to as I've observed the fantastic development of your nation in the last 40 years, it seems to me that you have always valued positive relationships with your neighbors. And during that period, many of those neighbors have loosened their post-World War II relationships with the United States. But I also heard you express some reasonable skepticism for the motives of the U.S. pivot to Asia. And it seems to me that by maintaining what you call the status quo in the South China Sea, that you are now motivating those neighbors to strengthen those ties with the United States that had been formally loosened, and now put themselves in a position where they are perhaps less friendly than they had been with your own nation. Would you comment on that? It seems like in some ways you're acting against your own self-interest and facilitating U.S. pivot to Asia.
Thank you very much. Actually, the relationship between China and those countries on China's periphery has been becoming increasingly merger. I don't think the relationship in history are normal, because that relationship was established during the Cold War years, and in which the two blocs are confronting against each other. As for countries, I don't think it's possible for them to have no problem. Problems, if they have problems, I think that's natural. The problem lies in the fact that the problems should not develop to that extent that will totally destroy the relationship between the countries. Here, I would like to emphasize a few points. One is that China respects the interests of the United States in South China Sea. You have the right to navigate in this area. You have interest in your military deployment in Southeast Asia. You have very close economic ties with those countries in Southeast Asia. And you have some military alliances with some countries in Southeast Asia, or you have some partners or security partners in Southeast Asia. We respect your presence. We respect your interest in this area. So we have no objection against these sort of activities or U.S. presence in Southeast Asia. What we want is that the United States will behave themselves as what they say. So in Chinese, we have a very, very old saying. We will not only listen to what you talk, we will also see what you behave. So this is very important. We would like to see the practical actions of the United States in promoting stability and development of this area, in promoting the maintenance of status quo as well as other things. I think in the future in South China Sea, China and the United States can share their hands in doing some things. First is to handle the relationship between the existing laws and the UNCLOS. This is very important because some of the problems, some of disputes arise from the different explementations of the different laws. Secondly, China and the United States should join their hands to maintain stability, peace, as well as status quo in this area. And thirdly, China and the United States should try their efforts to maintain or to protect the interests of different countries, not only that of China or that of the United States, but the interests of all those countries in this area. What I want to respond to Professor here about the mechanisms, I think in this area we are not short of mechanisms because we have so many mechanisms like ASEAN Asia, ASEAN Forum, 8+3, 8+1, 10 plus 3, 10 plus 1, 10 plus 8, etc. So we are not short of any mechanism. The problem is that the parties concerned should be sincere in maintaining peace and stability in this area. And the problem is that no party should carry out provocation against any other party. I think this is very important. Thank you.